Chuck Norris was called a hick with no future. What happened 10 years later? Silenced everyone, Ryan, Oklahoma, spring of 1958. A Thursday morning just before 9. The town was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other before the heat of the day made walking unpleasant, and most people did exactly that. Walked where they needed to go, said what needed to be said in the fewest words possible, and went back to whatever they had been doing before. Ryan was not a place where ambition was rewarded with encouragement. It was a place where staying was the natural expectation, and leaving required a reason that the town would judge before you'd gotten 20 miles down the road. Chuck Norris was 17 years old when the remark was made. He was standing near the back of a gathering, a community event of some kind, the details of which have blurred with time, but whose emotional shape has not, and a man whose name is not worth preserving, a man of middle age and the particular self-assurance of someone who has never left a small town and has therefore never had his assumptions tested, said it clearly enough that several people heard. He was talking about Chuck to someone else, the way people sometimes do in small communities, as if the subject of the conversation is furniture, present but not listening. He said something to the effect that the Norris boy was a sweet kid, but there was nothing there, a hick from nowhere, no future. The kind of boy who would end up fixing cars or working a counter somewhere, and that was probably fine because that's what Ryan produced, and there was no shame in it. There was no shame in it. That part was true. But the assessment of Chuck Norris, the specific conclusion that there was nothing there, that the young man standing at the edge of the room with his quiet manner and his poor family and his undistinguished academic record represented a ceiling as much as a floor. That part was a failure of imagination so complete that it would be almost comic if it weren't so ordinary. Most people who amount to something were once standing in a room where someone drew that same conclusion. The world is full of assessors who mistake quietness for emptiness and difficulty for defeat. Chuck heard it. He has never made a great deal of this in interviews. He is not a man who builds his story around grievances, which is itself a form of discipline. But those who knew him in those years have said that he absorbed things quietly and completely, the way certain soils absorb rain. Nothing bounced off him. Everything went in. What he did with it once it was inside him was a different matter. He enlisted in the United States Air Force later that year. There was nothing heroic in the decision, at least not in the way the word is usually used. He needed a way out, and the military was the way that presented itself. He had no money for college, no connections, no path that was visible to him or to anyone who knew him. The Air Force offered structure, training, a salary, and the possibility of becoming something that Ryan, Oklahoma had not been able to help him imagine. He took it. Korea in 1958 was still in the complicated aftermath of a war that had ended only 5 years before. The peninsula was divided, the South was rebuilding, and the American military presence was both a practical reality and a symbol of something larger and more ambiguous that the young men stationed there were not generally equipped to analyze. Chuck was not stationed there to analyze anything. He was there because the Air Force had sent him there, and he went with the compliance of someone who has not yet learned what he is supposed to want. He found the dojang by accident. Or perhaps it was not an accident. Perhaps it was the particular sensitivity of a person who has spent years looking for something without knowing what it is, so that when it appears, even briefly and partially, recognition happens before understanding. He saw men training in a gym near the base. The movements were unlike anything he had encountered. Precise and powerful and connected to something he couldn't name, some internal architecture that the external movements were expressing rather than merely performing. He went in and asked if he could watch. They let him. He started training within the week. Tang Soo Do, the Korean martial art that would become the foundation of everything that followed, is at its core a system built on the premise that the body and the mind are not separate problems. You do not train the body and then add discipline afterward like a garnish. The discipline is the training, the control is the technique. A practitioner who is technically proficient but mentally scattered is not a practitioner. He is an athlete, which is a different and lesser thing. Chuck Norris, who had spent his entire young life in a state of quiet searching, encountered in Tang Soo Do a framework that organized everything he already was into something that could become more. He trained for 4 years in Korea. His instructors were demanding in the particular way of Korean martial arts masters of that generation. Not cruel, but completely uninterested in your comfort. Progress was measured not by enthusiasm or effort, but by result. Either you could execute the technique or you could not. Either you understood the principle or you did not. The training stripped away the habits of self-protection that most people accumulate by adolescence, the tendency to protect the ego by not fully committing, by leaving yourself a way to explain failure before it happens. You could not train that way and improve. You had to commit completely to each movement, each moment, and accept that failure was information rather than judgment. When he returned to the United States in 1962, he was 22 years old. He had a wife, Diane, who had married him with the practical faith of a woman who believed in a person rather than in circumstances. He had a rank in Tong Soo Do that gave him the technical right to teach. He had a few $100s and no business experience and no connections to the martial arts community in California, and no reason, on paper, for anyone to believe that a school he opened in Torrance would become anything other than another struggling small business in a strip mall. He opened it anyway. The first months were difficult in the way that beginning things is always difficult. Not dramatically, not with the kind of difficulty that makes for compelling narrative, but with the grinding, unglamorous difficulty of a person who's doing everything right and seeing very slow results and having to choose, each morning, to continue. He taught whoever came in. He taught businessmen and teenagers and veterans and people who had read something in a magazine about karate and were curious. He taught with the seriousness of someone who understood that what he was transmitting was not just technique, but a way of organizing a human life, and that this responsibility did not diminish because the class only had 4 students. The reputation built slowly. In the tournament circuit, his name began to circulate, not quickly, not with the acceleration of a gifted self-promoter, but with the steadiness of someone whose results spoke without being asked. He competed. He won. He lost. He competed again. He approached the loss the way his training had taught him to approach everything. As information, as a question the body was asking that required a specific and honest answer. By 1968, 10 years after the man in Ryan had delivered his verdict, Chuck Norris was the reigning professional karate middleweight champion of the world. His school in Torrance had expanded. He had opened additional locations. He had students who were themselves beginning to compete and win. He had been introduced to Bruce Lee, a meeting that would become one of the defining relationships of his professional life, a friendship between 2 men who were both, in different ways, trying to answer the same question about what the martial arts could become when freed from the limitations of tradition without losing the depth that tradition carried. The man from Ryan, Oklahoma, would have been in his 50s by then. Whatever he was doing, it is safe to assume he was still in Ryan, or somewhere very much like Ryan, and that the assessment he had delivered with such casual confidence in 1958 had not undergone revision. Most people don't revise. They simply stop being relevant to the story. What had happened in those 10 years was not magic. It was not the unfolding of some destiny that was always going to arrive, regardless of effort. It was a sequence of choices made in private, under no external pressure, in the spaces where a person's character reveals itself. The choice to enter the dojang and ask if he could watch. The choice to train seriously when serious training was painful and the results were distant. The choice to open a school in a strip mall when everything reasonable said the odds were poor. The choice to learn from each loss instead of protecting himself from what the loss was trying to say. Bruce Lee, who knew Chuck well by the late 1960s, said something in a conversation that has been paraphrased in various ways across the years, but whose substance is consistent. That Chuck's most dangerous quality was not his technique, which was excellent, but his patience. He was a patient man in a discipline that rewarded patience above nearly every other quality, and he had arrived at that patience not because it was natural to him, but because he had trained it the way he trained everything else, deliberately, repetitively, and with the understanding that the work itself was the point. In 1974, he retired from competition undefeated, the professional karate middleweight champion for 6 consecutive years. He had won titles that the man in Ryan hadn't known existed in a discipline the man in Ryan had never heard of in cities the man in Ryan would never visit. The silence that followed Chuck's success was not the silence of humiliation, though it may have contained some of that. It was the larger silence that falls when a prediction has been made with great confidence and the world has simply declined to cooperate with it. There are boys all over this country, and girls, and grown men and women, who are standing in rooms where someone is drawing the same conclusion. The verdict has been delivered with the same casual confidence and the same failure of imagination. Most of them will hear it and be diminished by it, not because the verdict is true, but because a 17-year-old doesn't always have the equipment to dismantle it. Chuck Norris was 17 once, in Ryan, Oklahoma, and someone told him there was nothing there. What he did with the next 10 years was not a rebuttal. It was simply a life, lived at the full height of what he was willing to work for. The rebuttal took care of itself. Ryan, Oklahoma, 1958. Los Angeles, California. 1968 and 1974.